You're listening to Investigation Insiders by Integras Intelligence.
Hello again, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Investigation Insiders. This is Farhad. Hope you are all doing well and staying safe. We are actually recording this episode in the middle of the situation between Russia and Ukraine as it continues to escalate, actually. So, just another reminder of how lucky we are to be Americans and in this country. Thank you to all of those that help protect us and our freedom. So we are very fortunate. Thank you so much. Today, I'm joined by a friend and attorney, Lisa Weinberger. How are you, Lisa?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks again for joining me today. We've been talking about this for a long time, so I'm glad we got it off the ground. So Lisa and I have been friends for a long time. Her mom, Carol, who's a retired NYPD detective, worked with me for many years. So, as we were talking about before we started here, Lisa, I think a discussion about Carol and the laughs we've had over the years might be a show in and of itself. So, let's save that for another day, if that makes sense to you.
Yes, it absolutely would be a show in and of itself. And yes, we should save that.
For another day, absolutely. So, why don't we start by why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself so our audience could kind of understand you a little bit better?
Sure. So I went to law school at Hofstra University. I graduated from law school in 2008, and I've been admitted to the New York State Bar since February of 2009. I work for a small firm on Long Island. Allen R. Morgenstern PC is the name of my firm. And I've actually been here since my second year of law school. I started interning here in 2007 and I never left. We do everything. We're a full service general practice firm, but I mostly, since the beginning of my career, have focused mostly on family and matrimonial law. So that's everything from prenuptial agreements to divorces to custody matters, everything in between. And then also post-divorce matters. If there's an issue with, your divorce agreement or an order of the court, or even if there's not some issue, but there are some, matters that need to be dealt with after a divorce, such as estate planning and beneficiary changing and things of that matter. So I'm very well versed in those areas of the law.
Excellent. Well, as you know, we've kind of discussed this. Integris generally doesn't work on divorce or family matters unless there's a very specific reason. However, we get asked about it all the time. As I've mentioned on the show before, every time people hear the term private investigator, they're immediately thinking about cheating spouses, surveillance vans, things like that. So while we may not be able to assist from a legal perspective, we wanted to be able to offer our audience some expertise on the matter, on these matters. And so you've heard us talk about crisis management over and over again. You've also heard us talk about the key to managing a crisis being prepared. And so family matters, I think, are no different, especially divorce. So our goal today during our discussion is not to give you advice on getting over on your significant other. It's really meant to help you get to a resolution in an effective and efficient manner. So what are your thoughts on that, Lisa?
So I couldn't really say it better than you just said it. Whenever a potential client comes in to see me, I always stress and will always stress the importance of approaching a divorce as more of a business transaction than an emotional transaction. And for a potential client, I can appreciate that that's hard. They're in a marriage, they are understandably emotional about that possibly coming to an end, and everybody has a different reason for it coming to an end. Some are more take a more of an emotional toll than others, but I've yet to meet a potential client that has absolutely no emotions in the game. And part of my job as an attorney is to look at the facts and circumstances of their matter without that emotional portion of it, and just as a business transaction, while of course also having sympathy and empathy for what they are emotionally going through at the time. But when things can be resolved amicably, and I always err on that side of let's start coming from an amicable place and trying to work this out instead of coming from a place of trying to get over on your spouse or trying to get the upper hand or fishing around for information that you probably at the end of the day don't really need. It always works out better for that potential client at the end of the day, both from an emotional standpoint. I think it's healthier emotionally and healthier for your mental health. And also from a cost perspective, it's much more cost efficient to at least come into my office agreeing almost with yourself that you're going to try your hardest to look at your potential divorce as more of a business transaction than as an emotional one-up on your spouse, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And it's along the same lines that we discuss. And so, like, again, the conversation with us usually starts a little bit different than the conversation with you, right? So when they come to us, it's immediately I think my husband or wife is cheating on me. I think they're hiding money. I think they're doing something that I don't know about. And I'd like for you guys to conduct an investigation without really any plan or thoughts on how everything ties together. So my advice is to always strategize before executing. My team has heard me say that over and over and over again. And so the only way to do that in my mind is to speak to an attorney before doing anything to ensure that you don't do something that may actually hurt you down the line. So what are your thoughts on that?
So the first thing that I tell people when they come into my office, and let's say they come in with the same thing that they're telling you, I think my spouse is cheating on me. I
Yep.
need somebody to, find that out. Let's say they came in and they've already talked to you and they say to me, well, I already met with Farhad and Farhad told me it's better to strategize before we execute anything. So here now I'm sitting in your office and let's strategize. I think that my husband or my wife is cheating on me. What do I do now?
Right.
And the first thing that I say to them is, well, from a legal perspective in the state of New York, and I'm only talking about within the state of New York,
Yep.
whether your spouse is or isn't cheating on you is sort of irrelevant.
Yeah.
New York has what I like to call a no-fault divorce statute, which means that if somebody comes into my office and they say to me, listen, my marriage is over, I don't know if my spouse agrees, but I want out of this marriage, my answer is, well, then we're going to get you out of this marriage. Whether your spouse is cheating on you or not, it doesn't make a difference for purposes of getting you a divorce. And it also doesn't make a difference for purposes of what you may or may not be entitled to in that divorce. So a cheating spouse, and this is excluding circumstances where perhaps there's a postnuptial or a prenuptial agreement in place that speaks towards infidelity. But if there's no agreement that speaks towards infidelity, and those agreements are very rare. If you come to me and you say, I think my spouse is cheating on me, we have to prove it. And I'm going to say to you, it doesn't matter, even if it's true. It doesn't make a difference for purposes of what you may or may not be entitled to at the end of the day. And it also doesn't make a difference if what you're telling me is that you want out of this marriage.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the trickiest things, right? Because again, it's a similar conversation where, sometimes, most of the time, we don't even get involved in the investigation unless there's a very specific reason. But we say to them, like, same thing, it's probably not going to help you. So, um, if it's a matter of peace of mind, like you want to know, what the answer is, that's one thing, but will it help you legally? That's another thing. Another sort of interesting thing that we find, and I'm sure you guys deal with in managing these types of clients, is that usually there's an answer in the client's head that if they don't get that answer, my spouse is cheating and they're cheating with this person and this is what they're doing, they're not satisfied. So it just becomes very, very tricky. And it goes back to the point you were making about the emotions being
Yeah.
involved, right? I mean, so it just becomes tricky. So why don't I give you a sample scenario, right?
Sure.
Say I'm a man, I live in New York. I've been married or my wife and I have been married for 20 years. I hope my wife doesn't listen to this out of context. But we have three kids, ages 16, 14, and 12. We own a house together and two cars. Both of us work.
Mhm.
I think that my wife is cheating on me and I'm thinking about getting divorced. So I come to you with that situation. Why don't you walk me through what happens next?
Sure. So first, I just want to make clear that obviously every situation is different.
Yep.
But coming to me with those circumstances, the first conversation that we're going to have is I'm going to tell you exactly what I just told you the last time that I spoke, which is I understand your concern that your wife may or may not be cheating on you. However, for purposes of getting divorced and settling your divorce, um, whether or not she's cheating on you doesn't it's irrelevant for purposes of your legal divorce matter. Okay, if it's relevant, like you said, Farhad, for your mental well-being, then as harsh as it sounds, that's really something that you would need to speak to with a mental health professional. And I actually advise a lot of my clients, whether they're able to look at this as a financial transaction or not, that talking with a mental health professional during the time that your matter for divorce is pending is always helpful. It can never hurt because it's a huge life change, and whether you realize it or not at the beginning, I find that clients that take my advice and do that really have an easier time handling the stresses that they don't even see coming down the pike when they first, start. So that's the first conversation that I would have. I would then sit down with him and we would start going through financials. And in our first meeting, I would, sit down with a list. I would take as much information from him as he had with respect to what specific financials they have, and I'll go through that list in a minute. Um, and I would prepare him for all of the different things that he's going to need to know, that he's going to need to have copies of, and that he's going to need to present in one form or another so that so that a global resolution could potentially be reached. And in reaching a global resolution, what we really need to have is, everybody puts their finances out on the table. And we do that in what's called a net worth statement. Okay, in New York State, every single case that goes before the court is required to have filed by both parties a net worth statement. And the information that's contained in that net worth statement is almost everything financial about your life. So it's going to go through your assets, it's going to go through your liabilities, it's going to go through your expenses. And at a first meeting with a client, I always like to prepare them for that so that they can start thinking along the terms of putting together a portfolio, we can call it, of paperwork that's going to be necessary coming down the pike, if that makes sense. So
Sure.
I'll go through some of those things that I tell people to start thinking about. The first thing that I tell them to do is change all of their passwords to their email. I tell them to create a new email address to communicate with me specifically that perhaps their spouse doesn't know about. Not because we're trying to get one over on the spouse, but just because we want to make sure that what we, meaning a potential client and me as their attorney, are discussing and talking about is confidential. We don't want any of that to be, accidentally left on a screen or discovered by anybody, including their spouse, because what's said between me and a client is sacred, really. So I always tell them to make a new email address, one that we can communicate on securely. That's the first thing. And I think I said already, but if I didn't, I also tell them to change their passwords, change your email passwords, change your work email passwords, change anything where you are exchanging information with anybody else, whether or not you think it may be relevant to your divorce. I always say be cautious and just change all of your passwords. So, we'll go through all of that. Also, I'll explain, and I'll just give you a brief explanation as to what is considered marital property in the state of New York. So in the state of New York, there are two different kinds of property you can have. There is marital property, which is property that's accumulated and acquired during your marriage. And there's separate property, which is anything that you acquired prior to the marriage and also during the marriage via certain means. And those means are by gift or by inheritance, or by settlement. Personal injury settlements are also considered separate property. And in New York State, separate property is not distributable by the court. So any of your separate property remains your separate property after a divorce, and anything that's considered to be marital property is on the table to be distributed equitably by a court or in a settlement. And equitably does not necessarily mean equally. It's not 50-50. It means fairly. And we don't have the time to get into how the court would determine things like that, or how attorneys that are trying to settle a case would determine what's equitable. But for purposes of this conversation, I think it's important just that your listeners know that there are two different types of property, marital and separate property is not distributable at the end of a divorce, and marital property is. Okay. The other thing that I think is very important for your listeners to be aware of is that there are certain times where separate property can be converted unintentionally by a spouse into marital property. And what I mean by that is, and I'll just give you an example. Let's say this potential client that we're talking about, this man that came to see me, says, listen, 5 years ago, my mother died and she left me $200,000 in cash, in a cash account, in a savings account. And I took that $200,000 and I kept it separate in my, in a separate account in my name. It's still sitting there. I've not done anything with it. It's just there. My answer to him would be great, because now you've taken that separate property and you've kept it separate. You've not commingled it with any marital funds. And for that reason, our position will be and will prevail that $200,000 is your money and it's not distributable in your matter for divorce. That's an easy case, but that's not normally what happens. Normally when somebody comes and they say, look, my mom, she left me this $200,000 and I used it to, I deposited it into my joint account with my wife, and I've used it to make improvements to our house, and I used it to send to pay for an SAT course for my 16-year-old, and to do this and to do that. And that's where things become tricky and hairy. And the reason why is because that person has now commingled their separate property funds with their marital property, and it's going to be hard to distinguish what, if any, portion of that $200,000 has remained separate. And I say that just because people don't live their lives and shouldn't live their lives contemplating a divorce, right? I mean, people don't normally live like that. Your marriage is good until it's not.
Yep.
But there are certain situations that can make things more or less complicated, and commingling separate funds with marital funds is one that we come across often, and one that people should just be aware of. So that's the first conversation that I would have with that person, is sort of going through, making a list of what assets you have, and what of those assets are marital property, and what of those assets could potentially be considered separate property, and what we would need to do, if anything, just to back up our claim that those assets that we say are separate property are separate property.
It's interesting as I listen to you, and you started off sort of the podcast talking about looking at this as a business transaction, right? Almost a divorce. And so in thinking about the discussion you're having, first of all, there's a lot of really interesting points there, some that I've thought of, some that I have not. So that's really, really helpful. But to think about, all right, well, here's what this is. This is essentially a transaction that's going to happen, the divorce. And so it's a matter of making it easy or not easy. And here's the things that we need to think about. And here are the ancillary items, are they cheating? Which don't matter to the nuts and bolts of the divorce, but it's really a separate thing. I also really find the comments about a mental health professional interesting. Yeah, and while it's obvious after you mention it, there's a lot of that coming into play. Even the mayor of New York City talking about dealing with the homeless, where it's going to be a multi-pronged sort of approach, where there's a mental health professional, law enforcement, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a really good, and I wonder how many people actually listen to your advice, which obviously you can feel free to talk about. But the other thing that rings interesting to me as it relates to our world is the net worth statement, right? So again, aside from the cheating aspect of it, people are always concerned about hiding assets, right? And they have these ideas of the person hiding assets and doing an asset search and all that sort of stuff. Just out of curiosity, how damaging can, I guess, not being truthful on that document be?
Extremely damaging in New York State specifically, and again, I can only speak towards New York State, but I do understand that this is sort of across the board.
Yeah.
Being truthful with your assets and everybody being satisfied that they know the assets of the other person is extremely important. If you think of it this way, if you and I, let's say we're married and we're going to now get divorced, and I say, listen, I agree, you take the house and the checking account, and I'll take our vacation. We have a vacation home in our marriage, so I'm going to take our vacation home, and I'm going to take our other savings account. And how can I, as a person, really be making that agreement if I don't know what you have? If you have this other account that I don't know about,
right,
then when I made that agreement, it wasn't fair because I had no idea that you had that agreement.
Sure.
So being truthful and being upfront is not only important, it's required. And that's one of the reasons that a net worth statement is required to be filed in the statement in New York State. When you submit it to the court, it's sworn, and it's sworn to testimony. It's the same thing as though you raised your hands in a courtroom and swore under oath that these are the assets that you have. And right. I don't have to tell you, you don't want to lie to a court. You don't want to say something under oath that's not truthful. So it's sworn testimony. It's considered a sworn testimony. And I can't stress enough the importance of being open and honest. It will come back to bite you if you're not.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because, as you know, like our clients are our clients, right? In all the work that we do, right? And so it's not necessarily true that, and it may not be an intentional sort of, where they're telling you not the complete truth, but it could be just they don't even realize, right? And so, I asked that question for everyone's benefit because, it's one of the things that we try to tell our clients in all types of cases, right? Is you got to give us the full story and let us decide if we want to be involved, how we can help, and actually come up with a plan that can help you. But if you sort of mislead us, then it becomes a problem for everyone. So, and I think, again, a lot of people, particularly with divorces, are just trying to keep as much for themselves as possible. And if they can get away with it, get away with it.
Of course, I think, full disclosure is really the basis for, at least in my business, but I can't imagine it not being in any business. Full disclosure is really the basis that everything is built on. It's the foundation. And without it, without me trusting that what you're saying specifically in a sworn document disclosing to me that you have, if I can't trust that, and I'm sure, Farhad, that a lot of your clients feel that they can't trust that, and that's probably why they're asking for your help.
Sure.
If I can't trust that, then how can I move on and negotiate in good faith
Right.
terms for my divorce? Because I have no idea what you have.
Sure.
Right. And
Yeah,
just as an aside, if I can,
of course.
and people, my friends included, think that I'm annoying, but I will state it every day if I have to. Whether you have assets or not, having a prenuptial agreement is important because you need to know what's there. You have to know what you are walking into. Burying your head in the sand and just saying, yeah, I'll figure it out later if I have to, is not going to help you down the line. Knowing, and not necessarily knowing what you're going to walk away with. I'm not saying it from that perspective. I'm just saying that it's very helpful for you to know whether you're divorced or not, whether a divorce comes down the line or not. It's helpful walking into a marriage to know what your spouse has, what their liabilities are, what your potential liabilities could be as a result of, your marriage to them. It's important just for purposes of full disclosure. Everybody should know what everybody has in a marital type situation before they get married, in my opinion.
Yeah. No, that's obviously a very, very touchy subject.
Very touchy.
Yep. And do you feel like more people are today signing prenups, or is it less, or is it unchanged, or?
I think it's trending towards more because I think this day and age, the reason that I can think of it is that more families have two income households at this point.
Yep.
And it's not, I would imagine that years ago, and even when I first started practicing, it was more common that a husband would be going out and earning a living and being the breadwinner, and the wife would be at home taking care of the kids. And that's less and less common nowadays, where we see mostly both parties going out and working, and also getting married later in life, where they've worked for a while and they've accumulated some assets, right? I would imagine that years ago, when people were getting married in their early 20s, nobody had really accumulated anything at that point, so a prenup sort of sounded silly. But now, even if you're talking about two W-2 workers, let's say, let's say a police officer and a teacher. There happens to be a lot of police officers married to teachers for some reason. Both of them have been working, let's say 8, 9, 10 years before they get married, and they've been paying into the pension system, and they have this asset that they at that point probably don't realize is worth so much money.
Right.
But it is. It's a very valuable asset. And especially with teachers and first responders, that pension seems to be their Achilles heel, right? I mean, they will almost do anything to keep 100% of that pension. And it
Right.
would be much easier for them to do that had they just signed a simple agreement in the beginning of the marriage saying, listen, what you know, save in your pension or your retirement account is yours, and what I save in mine is mine.
Right.
Which seems to be the way everybody wants to, well, I can't say everybody, but in cases where you have two people with a pension, a lot of times that's what happened. You keep yours and I'll keep mine. Of course, it's different if you're talking about a 25-year marriage and only one person was working, excuse me, and contributing towards a pension. Then that pension is and should be marital property that can be divided between the two, you know, the two spouses.
Sure.
But you know, it just makes things easier if people know walking into it, you know, what they're walking into. That's my whole point with a prenuptial agreement. They are more common now, I think, but certainly, you know, 95% of divorces are do not have you know, a prenuptial agreement attached to them.
Interesting. Yep. Yeah, no, that's all very interesting. So, um, usually we end this show with like takeaways, which there's a lot in this. But I guess maybe we could end it with tips for anyone that is thinking about divorce or in the process. I think you've sort of gone over it, but to summarize it, what would you tell people listening to this episode?
Okay, so here are my big tips. Number one, as I said before, secure your accounts, secure your email, change your password. The other thing that I tell people, and that I think is very important, is that every single thing that you write down in a text message, in an email, and specifically on social media
That's real.
is discoverable and will come up if things take a turn for uh you know, contentiousness. And as much as I try to keep people amicable and talk them into you know, settlements, or help them reach a settlement, a divorce is a contentious thing by nature. And a lot of times, even if we can end, and I always like to end, and most of my cases end in settlement and not in trial, um there will be some contentiousness along the way, especially when it comes to children and you know, child support and things of that nature. And one of the big things that I say to my potential clients is, listen, I can't take away things that you've done from this point before, but going forward, anything that you write down, think about if you would be comfortable reading that out loud in front of a courtroom full of people, because potentially that could happen.
Sure.
So even if you're at your wit's end with your spouse, keep things amicable in text message and on social media and in email. Be extra courteous. If you think you're being courteous, go a step further and be a little bit more courteous.
Hmm.
And that, I think, is a really important thing to know. And the other thing that goes along with that is when you have children, you have to do your best to keep your children out of this, what I'm calling a business transaction. Your kids don't and shouldn't know every step of the way that's going on. They don't need to know how you've been emotionally hurt by your spouse. They're kids, and you should let them be kids. And that's very important, for purposes of not only resolving things amicably between two people, but also if things can't be resolved amicably and if custody becomes an issue, everything that you do and say and share with your kids is going to be, you know, looked at under a microscope. You don't have the luxury when you're in a divorce and going through a divorce or going through a custody battle or something like that. You unfortunately don't have the luxury of keeping your life private. Your life is automatically going to be looked at under a microscope, and it could be very uncomfortable. And that's why you have to take steps to sort of ensure that you're doing everything that you can do to just sort of keep calm on the outside, even if you don't feel calm on the inside.
Sure. I mean, that's all really just great advice, and a great way to sort of conclude the show. So there's a lot that I took away from the show. Hopefully, I'll never need any of it.
Right.
But if anyone listening here is in need of assistance or would like to ask questions or needs advice, we'll put Lisa's information in the description of the podcast. Feel free to reach out to her directly. You can reach out to us. We can connect you as well. Thank you for continuing to listen. Thank you for the comments, the feedback. It's all very helpful. Lisa, thanks again for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Farhad.
Absolutely. Till next time, have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Don't forget to follow us. We are on LinkedIn and Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube.